How you doing, everybody? Dr. Stringer back at you, talking to you from my office on campus today. We're going to talk about the foundations of criminal justice research, and there's a few things that I wanted to just kind of touch on. You guys might want to look for in the readings and maybe try to underline or remember, as they might be important in the future. Just looking at this stuff, I'll just kind of move through these PowerPoints, and you guys have access to these too, so you don't have to feel the need to write all these things down. Theory is what we often do. We start with theory a lot when we are looking at research, because theory kind of tells us what we should expect and helps us to develop our hypotheses and things like that. So it's really discovering what is, not what should be. We're not really figuring out how things should be, but really how they are. And then maybe we might have some policy implications that maybe we should change them to be something different. This is quite problematic for evaluators, because it's like, well, we started thinking, what constitutes a good parole officer? How do you really operationalize that? If you want to evaluate parole officers, how do you know if they're good or bad? Well, do they have a lot of parolees who are committing crimes? That might be a good way to think about it. And your book goes into some more details about this stuff. And it aims to find patterns of regularity in social life, different norms and rules and things like that that we look at. And you can read more about these sorts of things in your textbook. But one of the things that you might want to think about is we often look at aggregates. We're not usually in criminal justice and sociology not looking at individual people so much as we are kind of the broader society, right? Or large numbers of people, so to speak. So these are how we look at social patterns, right? And so theory is usually written in these variable languages. And so your textbook is going to talk about variables a little bit, and so there's kind of this difference between attributes and variables. So an individual might have an attribute, like they might be married, right? And they're not going to have any variables within the person, because the person is going to be either married or single or divorced or widowed or something like that. They're not usually going to be multiple things. And so if we look at variable, or at least not at the same time, right? They could be married and they're also widowed, but they're not at the same time married and all of these different things, or married and single, so to speak. You're either married or you're single. Logical groupings of variables such as occupations, these make up good variables. And so then if we looked at a study and we kind of surveyed and asked everybody in the class, well, what is your occupation? Chances are a lot of you are going to have different occupations. Some of you might work at Taco Mac, and others, or some people might work at, some other, random place, Wendy's or something like that, or you might have an internship, or, so those would be considered variables. The occupation would be a variable, and then whatever each individual person's occupation would be kind of the attributes that make up that variable. Within variables, there's two different types of variables that we're mainly concerned with in this chapter, and those are independent and dependent variables. And I usually tell students, you can think about the dependent variable as being the effect, and the independent variable being the cause, or the thing that influences that effect, right? We usually call them independent, dependent variables because we try not to use this causal language so much in the social sciences, because it's very difficult to actually prove that something caused something else, which is something that we'll get at later when we talk about concatenate causation. Just for now, just know that these are things that this is what makes up an independent and a dependent variable. The ideographic explanation is when we attempt to explain a single situation exhaustively, to fully understand the causes of what happened, and the nomothetic explanation, I don't know who comes up with these words, seeks to explain a class of situations or events rather than a single one. There's some examples in your book that you can look at like that. And then this chapter also gets into kind of general and specific with deductive and inductive reasoning. And so deductive is kind of the reasoning that we're probably most familiar with. It moves from general to specific, from a logical or theoretically expected pattern to observations that test the presence of this pattern. So if social learning theory tells us that we should, as people hang out with other people who are criminals, then they'll learn this criminal behavior, then we have this deductively that we can then go out and collect some data to see if this actually happens or not. Inductive reasoning moves from the specific to the general. So you would say, well, we see that there's a whole lot of people out there that maybe are I don't know, using marijuana on campus, and then we used it, and then we noticed this is already happening, and then we kind of come up with some sort of specific reason as to why this is happening, and so we notice the data and the observations of things happening first, and then after we make the observation, then we come up with a theory as to why it's happening. So you see how they work differently. This won't come back too much later on, but some other things you might want to know about is the difference between what is known as qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative is usually non-numerical, so this usually involves interviews with people, maybe non-obtrusive observations, things like that. We're going to talk about more about this later on in class. Quantitative data is what you think about when it's usually your statistical data. It's numbers. It's really looking at ones and twos and threes and think about people's age and stuff like that. Whereas qualitative data is much different. It usually gets more into the why things are the way they are than quantitative does. So it does have some benefits. Terms used in theory construction, of course, theory is going to be a big one, right? Objectivity. We try to be objective in social sciences as much as possible. You might want to remember the idea of what a hypothesis is. And so hypotheses are something that we come up with, and we might hypothesize that drug use causes crime, right? And so then that would be our hypothesis. And you could come up with all sorts of other hypotheses if you wanted to. And there's three main elements of the traditional model of scientific models, which is conceptualization, operationalization, and observation. And so conceptualization is really you're just coming up with these concepts that maybe you want to measure. So maybe you want to measure drug use and you want to measure crime. Operationalization is when you actually figure out how you're going to define these things. How do you want to define drug use? Are you going to define drug use as just marijuana use, or all drug use, or all illicit drug use? Are you going to count alcohol in this? What about coffee and cigarettes maybe, or vaping? Is that going to be counted in drug use? And then same thing with crime. How do you want to measure crime? Do you consider people self-reporting of crime in the past year, crime ever? Has anybody ever smoked a joint? That might be more interesting than looking at whether someone's murdered someone, especially if you're doing a survey, because chances are if they murdered someone, they're probably not going to be out in the general population anymore. At least we hope so. So we look at the two logical systems, deductive, inductive theory, field research, and survey research. And this chapter is mainly just giving you kind of an overview of a lot of the things that we're going to talk about more later on in the class. So don't worry about it too much. It's not getting into too much depth right now. It's just kind of an overview. So looking at these things, you might think about how theory and research and policy are all kind of linked together to some extent. And the criminological evolution maintains that behavior is affected by environmental forces. We are all social beings, so we all are affected by other things that happen in our environment that we, don't really have a lot of control over sometimes. So ecological theories of crime and prevention, and you guys have probably already taken criminology, so you've already taken theory, so I'm not going to get into too much detail with these sorts of things, and I'll just let you all read those just as kind of a reminder, so to speak. If you haven't taken theory, if you haven't taken theory, don't worry. We're not going to use too much theory in this class, so it shouldn't be a big deal for you. But with that, I will sign off, and I hope you all read the chapter, and of course, please make sure you do your discussion boards and things like that. And remember that you need to reply to a few people each week. And I know you guys are like, I don't want to talk to more than one person, and I can't say as I blame you, but I didn't make up the rubric, and I have to grade everybody based on that rubric. So please make sure that you do that. And with that, I will talk to you next time.